Welcome to the Humans and Earth podcast. We bring you inspiration and practical resources for healing our planet and ourselves. It's time for soulful contributions that regenerate life on Earth. I'm Shara Arman, a thought leader and teacher who believes we're ready to renew Earth and heal ourselves in the process. You can find our work online at humansandearth.com and on Instagram at schoolhumansearth. I'd love for you to be on our newsletter list and receive our updates on Instagram. Please share our work at the School for Humans and Earth with anyone you think might be interested, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this podcast so that we can include more and more people in the regeneration revolution that I believe is happening on planet Earth. Welcome to today's episode. Welcome back to Humans and Earth. I am so happy to be bringing you today an interview with Dr. Saskia von Diest. She has been communicating with various forms of nature for the last 10 years, much of which she spent researching how intuitive and interspecies communication can be used in agriculture, which is also an interest of mine. I forgot to mention to you, Saskia. She also has 14 years of experience in teaching and facilitating through various forms and in many countries. She holds a PhD in plant pathology from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and her research has investigated quantum-based or subtle agricultural techniques and technologies that use sound, electromagnetics, catalytic substances, and human intuitive abilities in decision-making on farms. In 2021, Saskia founded Ecofluency to consult, teach, and facilitate nature communication. Her passion is creating opportunities for others to have their own experience of communicating with more than human nature and develop that for their own and the collective benefit. Very much also the interest of Humans and Earth. As a South African of Caucasian and Indian descent, Saskia is committed to healing the internal, ancestral, and sociocultural damage that privilege, sexism, and racism cause in the world through her work of helping people connect to their more than human relations in the natural world. Find her at ecofluency.org. Welcome, Saskia.
Thank you so much, Shara, for having me on your podcast.
Yes, it's my delight. And I was telling you before we began recording that I think it's really thrilling to see that we now have more and more people who early in their careers, like you, are stepping forward into a rich combination of academic science and more intuitive-based work. I was just thrilled when I found out about what you were doing. And I thought maybe to introduce our audience to your work, we could begin with you defining ecofluency. What does that mean to you?
So the long and the short of it is that I often describe ecofluency as the science, the art, and the magic of communicating with nature. And so when I talk about that, I'm talking about something that requires discipline with its science and the rigor that is required in developing it. You know, like any skill, there's a certain element of effort required, but there's also the art and the magic. So there's a creativity, there's room for ritual, there's room for enchantment. And that's really bringing us back to the essence of who we are, because humans are nature. So all of us are born with this ancient skill of two-way dialogue with more than human nature. And I talk about it using an expanded spectrum of human sensory awareness, because it's using not just our classical senses of our eyes and our ears and our nose and mouth and touch and so on, but it's also using our intuition, our inspiration, our imagination, our feelings, sensations, emotions, and any animal communicator or interspecies communicator will know what that's like. And of course, this isn't new. This is something that spiritual traditions and indigenous cultures have been saying for millennia. This is their worldview, this animist worldview, which is that not only is everything interconnected, but everything, all of nature is alive, it's conscious, you can communicate with it. So everything becomes everyone. A plant is not just an object, it's a person. And when people talk about nature, very often there's this distinction of it being the earth and everything in and on and around the earth. And of course, that is true. But in my experience, nature is so much more than that. And we'll get into that probably in the podcast. But so when I talk about that, I want people to remember that nature is more than the earth as well. And when I deliberately have this word ecofluency, because most eco comes from the Greek oikos, which means home. And most eco terms focus on the potential human benefit, which is wonderful, for example, through refining our observation with nature. But while those are really helpful to humans, they're typically one-sided. It's very often about observing nature, reading the book of nature, so on. But ecofluency enables that two-way communication, that conversation with the more than human world, so that you're not just cultivating a deeper understanding of how ecological systems function, but you're actually benefiting the humans and the other than humans. And so, most people have forgotten that this is a skill that lies dormant in them, but it can be rekindled and developed. And to date, I've not met a single person who can't. It's just a matter of willingness. And I find that it's really important now more than ever that we do share and we listen deeply to all of nature, not only for our own evolution, but for theirs too. And I think you speak about this in your podcast episode on nature spirits. And so I really appreciated you raising that point, because that echoes what I've been hearing as well.
Yes. Yes. Oh, thank you. There's so much I want to respond to there. I was thinking as you were talking, for listeners who love to read, I was thinking about the work of Matthew Hall in his book Plants as Persons, and Stephen Harding in Animate Earth, which are a couple of places people can go if they want to do some reading along these lines. But what I most appreciated in what you said was that several times you emphasized, and I believe this is so true, that the intuitive capacities humans have are just as much a part of us as our physical senses or our intellectual functioning. And you referred to indigenous traditions, which I think reminds us it's really, my background is in history, and so I can say it's really only been about 400 years, even 300 maybe, that we've taken these human intuitive capacities and really severely marginalized them. And it's so important for people to know that was just a little blip in human culture. What has been true for us all along, as you were implying, is that we are multi-sensory beings with these multivalent, not only two-way, but even multi-way relationships with the natural world. So thank you so much. I think your definition of ecofluency is rich and comprehensive and compelling.
Thank you.
So I would love for you to talk a little bit about how your own awareness and work evolved, because you were on a conventional path of scientific study in South Africa, and you have widened your skills, your training, what you do with clients, your areas of knowledge and sensing. You've widened them a great deal. So what was it like for you to transition from that very standard scientific focus to something much broader?
Yeah, I mean, I got into science because I wanted to make a difference in the world, like many scientists, and raised in Western scientific reductionist materialist worldview, I believed that science was going to provide the answers. And so did the whole thing of like, do a PhD and then stay in research, or, use that PhD and take it into industry with the weight of that title. So that's something that's unfortunately still recognized, as having those few letters after your name somehow brings that, seems to still bring a gravitas, even if it doesn't mean that you actually know all that much more than much of the rest of the population. And I certainly felt handicapped when I first came across animal communication during my PhD. My goal with the PhD was to find different ways of working on farms to reduce a particular apple disease. And so I was very conventional minded at the time, but something in me still really was seeking an enchantment since childhood that never went away. And so I heard about animal communication, and it took about a year before I actually did an animal communication workshop with Anna. And so doing that workshop, because I'd seen one or two articles, that were generally shunned, the ones like by Rupert Sheldrake, who people were like, even though the statistics in there are far more rigorous than most other scientific articles. But despite that, it was only gaining my own experiential evidence that changed my worldview. So doing that weekend workshop with Anna is what made me realize this is an experience nobody can take away from me. I'm never going to forget that. And so that changed everything for me. And so I wanted to explore how this was going to be, how this could be used in agriculture, because that was my lens at the time. And so from 2014 till 2020, I did postdoctoral research, like you mentioned in the bio, where I investigated how farmers use intuition and interspecies communication in their practical management decision-making. And what I found was that farmers and food gardeners from around the world were reporting that they were relying on these skills to inform their decisions, and that the benefits were really numerous and were dramatic very often. And that in itself was also very eye-opening. And I realized that, it was a shift. It wasn't like my entire worldview changed, my life changed, but I hadn't realized how very deep the conditioning went, which I had inherited and had grown up in. And so throughout my postdoctoral years, I developed my own nature communication ability, and I learned from various teachers, and that really helped. Embodying the practice helped to shift my worldview using different practices, different approaches. And in hindsight, that shift took much longer than I would have expected. And of course, the work's not done. There are still many blind spots that I meet, and I have to work quite often on softening and expanding my worldview. And as you might know, the personal development journey is part of the work of becoming a good nature communicator, and not just a good one, but an honest one. Facing your shadows, even when you fear that they might destroy you, is fortunately made easier when you realize that you have this resource you can lean on of the more than human realm, which is like infinitely bigger than humans, because they are the other than humans. Many of them are bigger and older and wiser and stronger and cleverer and kinder than you or any other human alive. And so going on that personal development journey becomes actually more resourced. And it can be really challenging. Not everybody goes through that in the nature communication journey, but I feel like it's kind of inevitable if you really want to do this well. And as a scientist by training, it was really hard for me to let go of needing to understand exactly how nature communication works, because that to me was that thing of like, but if I don't know how it works, then how can I really trust it despite like years of experiential evidence? And, I've often had to realize like, I don't actually understand how much of the technology that I use on a daily basis works. So, okay, nobody can actually explain the underlying mechanism. But what was most challenging for me in Western science, especially in agricultural science, was how they view nature communication. despite not knowing how it works, the very possibility of it is completely dismissed, often, despite the fact that we have like 100 years of empirical evidence to support the notion. Mm-hmm. But anyway, by 2020, roughly, I became less concerned with how nature communication works and more interested in that it happens and that it is very often practically helpful. And that's when I founded Ecofluency, and I realized that as long as I can continue to help others have their own experiences and develop my own experience and to promote other voices in the field, human voices in the field as well as other than human, that's really where the biggest impact is going to be with my work. And so it's still really, it's emergent. It's like a tiny little seedling, this organization, but I really hope that it will grow beyond me, and my work continues to evolve. So what I'm realizing is that it's a lot like learning anything about truth with a capital T. The closer you get to it, the more you realize how far away you are from it. And that's what I realized with nature communication. It's like my entire paradigm, my ontology, my worldview completely gets shattered on a regular basis. And that's okay. That living with uncertainty becomes like a way of life. Yeah.
And it does require a certain humility, and I don't know if tenacity is the right word. I mean, maybe, but you said so many things there that were meaningful and beautiful to me. But I think one aspect is you talked about the resistance that many people feel to the idea that nature communication could even be possible. There is an angle from which it can seem threatening. Yeah. I think it certainly threatens human supremacy and hegemony and exceptionalism. And we really need to work on, I think, helping people to ease themselves out of that fear. But it does require a certain humility, right? Because sometimes what a plant or animal will share with you isn't the easiest information to receive. I mean, it can often be something about, you're not in right relationship with me, or the people here are not in right relationship with me. So maybe we want to talk about that. I want to also, though, come back to what you were saying about I don't remember your exact words, but the incredible sense of support and nurturing that we also can experience through this work. And I started feeling really emotional because I've had some extraordinary conversations with trees this summer, and I've been so in awe of the profound wisdom and grace and desire to support humanity that is present right now in the natural world. So on the one hand, there is this need for humility because we may talk to our own companion animal or house plant or the plants in our garden or on the farm, and we may hear that they perceive us as doing harm or being out of alignment. But then there's this whole other experience that seems to be much more highly available right now, of how easy it is to encounter that the beings in the natural world they're actually yearning to connect with us and support human evolution so that there can be greater harmony here. So you said a lot of things. I've responded on a few points. Tell just anywhere you want to go next is fine.
I like what you pointed out there, the sort of the polar feelings that people might have of the fear of like, but this threatens my worldview, but also it can bring so much. Of course, that's the same with any kind of reality. You know, you engage in any kind of relationship, there's going to be a risk. That person, even just another human, is going to threaten your worldview. But this threatens our entire nature of reality often. And that's exciting. It's like, why are we alive if not for that excitement, that adventure, that journey? And that's what I want to raise as a point, that by the end of this, people will hopefully remember that this is an adventure. And many people might be thinking, oh God, this is just too overwhelming. I've already got enough overstimulation in my life. And it's like, okay, I totally get that. I totally understand that your nervous system is on high alert most of the time because you're in like a survival mode, you're in crisis. And what nature communication invites is also trying less hard and actually putting your own life not completely in their hands. It's not giving up responsibility for your life, but it's saying, can you help me? So you can lean on powers who are far greater, far older, wiser, who do support in ways that we can never imagine. And you don't always get what you want, but you always get what you need. Even when it doesn't look, feel like it. I wouldn't change a thing about my nature communication journey because it's been so deeply rewarding.
I think one thing that you're suggesting to relates to the way in which many people right now seem to feel very alone and lonely, overwhelmed, and maybe like kind of like lone agents against the world. And one thing that is really amazing about nature communication is that, at least in my experience, most beings in nature are connected to a much larger network. So you can talk to an individual tree and it often shares things about what the network of trees is experiencing. So I really want to highlight this for people who are feeling overwhelmed. And as you said, in the way the world is working right now, a majority of people are experiencing nervous system overload. And so there is a way in which nature communication it's like beyond grounding. It's more than centering. It connects you to the network of life on this planet so that you realize, of course, you're not alone at all. You don't need to feel alone, and you can participate in these larger networks. So that's something maybe really beautiful and helpful for people to be aware of.
I'm really glad you raised that because it wasn't something I was going to touch on in this podcast. I've touched on it in other things where I've spoken or written about nature communication, but it's something that bears mentioning always, I think, and every time that it's brought up, I find that it resonates for people, and that is that, like you said, when you feel overwhelmed and you think, I don't want to feel more pain, more suffering, and if I open up to nature communication, I'm going to hear about it more from the voices of those who are suffering. And what I've experienced and what many other Indigenous elders and wisdom keepers and nature communication practitioners in the West have found is that very often nature isn't pain, but we're the ones who are suffering.
Yes.
And so what nature communication offers is the tool to open up a conversation, and rather than just use the tools that we have available to gather data about what's going wrong in the world, we can say, so how do you actually feel about this tree, goat, microbe, cloud? What is going on for you about all of this? And very often the message is, can you just relax and learn to love yourself? And then allow us to love you as well. And we can find a harmonious solution together. But if you keep fighting and resisting, and I mean, I say that as, speaking to you, but that was me as well, then you're just going to make life harder for yourself. Yes. And so the slowing down and the listening can make your life more efficient, your decisions more, not just informed, but truly impactful. And so much of the work that is co-created truly in harmony with nature, in conversation, that's done in counsel, is actually where it makes a difference. There's leverage to be found and huge rewards to be gained. And I'm not talking about just financial. Sometimes it's not financially rewarding, but it's more meaningful. Life becomes more fulfilling. And you've spoken about the loneliness thing, and that's something I want to speak to, because I didn't realize how alone I felt until that nature communication workshop 10 years ago, nearly 11 years ago with Anna. And that was my take-home message, not, oh my gosh, I can talk with all of existence. It was, I don't have to feel alone anymore. I could be on a desert island and I can talk with all of life around me, the sand and the sea and the sun and everything, if I survive, that is. But it was this realization that actually, logically, I've heard people talking about the fact that we're all connected and we're all relatives. And yes, that's true. But this was a felt experience. And when I've extrapolated that over the years, because I didn't know what it was like to feel depressed and even suicidal until after my nature communication journey started. And I'm grateful that I had nature communication as a resource throughout it all. Because when it got really bad, and I mean, just for the record, I chose not to use pharmaceutical medication, and all the other practices that I did, meditation and yoga and alternative and holistic practices, they were all helpful. But the thing that was the most helpful throughout it all was being able to ask the earth, when I really was at that point of like, I'm done. I don't want to be here anymore. Being a human is too much for me right now. I'm sorry. Much as I want to help, I can't. Can I come home? Can I just stop being here now? And the response I'd so often get was, yeah, my child, you can, of course. It's your life. You choose what to do with it. But I'd rather you stayed, and I will look after you, because there's so much to be gained. And it's not just about being in service, but you are allowed to be alive just for the sake of being alive. You deserve to thrive. You deserve to have everything that you need if you let me help you with that. So like you said, the humility of actually saying, okay, I'll stay, I'll accept help. that was really difficult at first. But the more I've done that, the more I've had these really surprising, like beyond coincidental experiences where I have been looked after. And that's what I invite people to remember, is that yes, being a human is hard regardless of whether you communicate with nature or not. So if you were to start, you might find that it's actually more rewarding and less difficult, makes your life less difficult rather than more difficult.
Yes. Yeah. I so appreciate everything you just said, Saskia. And I was thinking that I think everything you just shared in a certain way describes what's wrong with modern culture, what's wrong with our environmental movement, because this deep grounding that you discovered in connection with nature's beings and with Earth, and what you shared about kind of the sense of freedom and flexibility and permission. And I too, like you, have had, well, many of those same crises of despair, but also many experiences of hearing from beings in nature. You are here to thrive in bliss and pleasure. And that's a very shocking message for those of us from developed countries, Western civilization, backgrounds of a lot of intellectual education, traditions, which are sometimes white and Protestant, but also show up in many of the world's cultures, traditions of hard work and sacrifice, which, again, unfortunately, these show up almost all over the world. But, to encounter these messages from nature's beings that we're not here to struggle, and yes, contribution, healing, regeneration, participation, crucial, but each of us is also here individually to be supported and thrive in the way that the members of an ecosystem experience and model. I agree with you. That is a perspective crumbling and rebuilding perspective, and it is out there for anyone. And that's a perspective that comes out of nature communication that could completely revitalize our so-called environmental movement, which, in some ways, I think our 20th century environmental movement is just completely expired, and it made some contributions, and I feel gratitude and respect. But I believe pretty strongly where we're going is everything you and I just talked about, where people are listening, we are participating, we are integrated, we are accepting support from the natural world so that we get ourselves healed enough that we can then give back to nature a support that is truly respectful and appropriate. So, well, there's a lot to talk about there, and I'll let you respond if you want to anything I just said. And then whenever you're ready, I know one thing that we did want to share with listeners in this conversation today is, how do people do this? And how do they engage with beings in the natural world in ways that are safe and respectful and collaborative for all parties, rather than domineering? Mm-hmm. And so, we can go there whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer that question because there's so much I can respond with, but it feels like it might be a bit much. And I would just be repeating what you've said in different ways. So to answer your question, the first thing, which is really obvious, is that nature transmits information all the time. And a dialogue is a two-way communication. So it's a matter of refining our ability and awakening our ability to listen, and then to have a conversation. So when having a conversation, I've distilled this 9-step set of guidelines, which I teach in my courses and workshops, that basically models on a telephone conversation or a Zoom conversation, because then it's easy for people to relate with. And so, for the sake of time, I won't go into the whole thing, but the long and the short of it is that there needs to be a beginning, the conversation, and then the end. So it needs to have boundaries. And boundaries is a big theme in my work. That's what sets apart Ecofluency from many other ways of teaching nature communication, is this focus or this emphasis on ethics and on safety. And so, okay, let's dive into, for example, in your conversation, once you've safely started it, you've set your clear intention, I would say it's really important to remember that there's this two-way conversation, or multi-way conversation, as you call it. So that means allowing time to really deeply listen to the other being with whom you're communicating in an open-ended way, because there might be quite a bit that this being wants to share with you before you start launching into your own questions. And this might be because it's the first time in centuries, if not millennia, that this one's had a human experience in this way, or an experience with a human in this way. And this can sometimes be the most rewarding and unexpected communication that happens in this dialogue. And so it might be that you actually get asked to do something, because many other than humans don't have opposable thumbs. They might not even have bodies. And so in order for us to enact our role as a keystone species to make the environment as rich and as abundant as possible, it might mean that they ask us to do something, like performing a little ritual or making an offering. But this is where I would say use your free will and your discernment. So this is the part where it's not being domineering, but you're also doing so in a way that is within your own capacity. So if something feels like it's outside of your capacity, you can negotiate it. So for example, it might be that, like, a mountain saying, tomorrow at dawn, I want you to come and make me a mandala of red fruits, while drumming or something. And it might be like, whoa, that's a lot. I've got work tomorrow morning. So you'll say, like, in my lunch hour, I will come and bring you like a plum and 3 cherries. is that acceptable? With reverence. And then the mountain might be like, yeah, okay, fine. So it's like a poor example, but it's one I sometimes use in my teaching, and people get it. They're like, this is how you negotiate also with other than humans, because just like humans, other than humans might be asking you something and they might not have had something in a long time. So they might be really hungry. So they want feeding. And a dear friend and mentor of mine, the late Dan Schreiber, used to say that it's nature that has the power and we have the will. And so we lend our will and she will lend her power. And I really like that, because that's exactly where we can co-create with nature, that sense of humans have the free will, and it's leveraging that in order to invite the power of nature to meet us. And that's how we find harmony. So that's one point that I wanted to bring up. And I think you mentioned reciprocity quite a bit in your own work, which I really appreciate. And like humans, other than humans are more likely to engage with you in the future if you're willing to show that you are genuinely grateful and are willing to reciprocate the help that they have given you. If you are asking, let's say, for example, an animal with a behavioral issue, you want them to do something like not jump up, then it makes a lot of sense, and this is common in animal communication teaching, to focus on what it is that you do want rather than what you don't want, and to explain why, so that they also, what's the word? There's a particular word I'm looking for and I can't remember right now, but they also feel invested in the outcome. So it's the same like with a child. You explain what your reason is behind wanting them to do something, and then they get it. So instead of don't jump up, you'd say, keep your paws on the ground, for example, or rather than like don't scratch to a cat, like keep your claws in or play gently, using the positive phrasing of what it is that you do want. And so those are some of the sort of beginner points. And then I would say, in order to have clear, meaningful, and very effective communication, I focus, like I said, on the ethics and the safety. So I say this, and I want to be gentle with this because I don't want to scare people off. Every quest has its risks, and nature communication is this magical, enchanting journey. It re-enchants our entire worldview as well as our world, because we start opening up to other than humans that are beyond what we can see. And even the physical beings whom we see start to become more than what we perceive them as. And so I've mentioned before that nature includes the earth and the benevolent beings that live in and on and around her, but it also includes all of those who are not necessarily benevolent. And so I've had to learn the hard way that, like humans, there are also other than humans who have their own agenda that they want to push. And some of them are bigger and clever and older and stronger and meaner than you. So at best, they're opportunistic. And if you're giving out attention, there are a lot of hungry souls. So it makes sense to ensure that your attention is directed, and you've set a clear intention as well, so that you can have a safer, clearer conversation that doesn't get eavesdropped or hijacked. Yeah. And so having those safe boundaries ensures that you're maintaining your own energy field in a way that's clear and doesn't get inappropriately influenced.
Yes. Can you, just to be helpful to people, can you give an example of the kind of intention that you set? Because I think what you're saying is very important.
Yeah. So at the beginning of all of my online consultations, for example, I have different ways of preamble in my work. So in an online consultation, I'll have an abbreviated version that's tailored, working in the digital realm. If I'm doing, let's say, a psychic clearing offline, that will look very different, might be more elaborate. A ceremonial conversation or ritual will have its own intention setting. And you could call that, some people might think of it as like setting up a sacred space, or you might just be like making the environment conducive for an intimate conversation. And so there are many different ways to do this. I would typically honor the directions because they're eternal, and the elements, and work with my own spirit team, guardians, guides, and allies who are both known and unknown. I work with 7 directions. Typically, there are more, but I won't go into the detail. But the reason I do all of this, and this is both for opening a conversation as well as for closing one. And the reason I do this is because if one forgets to close a conversation, it's a bit like leaving a phone off the hook or a Zoom call open. Like, it's not just a bit awkward, but it can be dangerous. And so, for example, conversation I had with a cat in the early years of my animal communication experience, was asking the cat to show me what was going on for her. And she showed me that she had a headache, and she showed me by overlaying it in my body. So I started getting a headache. By the end of the conversation, thanked her, but I forgot to close that conversation off. And for the next few days, carried on having a headache and forgot why that might be. And suddenly I realized it, closed off the conversation, and the headache stopped. So that's one example in the ways in which our energy fields become entangled when we're having a conversation. And this is with humans and other than humans. And so that means just having clear, safe, healthy boundaries with anyone means that we're maintaining a sense of sovereignty in our field. And that means that any conversation we have going forward with anyone else is also clearer. Does that answer the question?
I think that's really helpful. And I just want to mark, because it's a huge topic of personal interest and practice for me, and also just so relevant to this work. Right now, you might say humanity is in this very complex place of relearning both sovereignty and participation or collaboration. And that's really what you were just talking about. And it's, I invite people to accept the complexity of that and look for whatever mentoring and practice they need, both to be restoring or strengthening their own sense of sovereignty and expanding their ability to be in participation and collaboration with other beings.
Beautifully said. Absolutely. And the reason that I raise all of this is because there's a risk that people feel intimidated by this idea that, oh, but nature communication can be unsafe. And sure, I get that completely. My goal with raising this is so that people can make an informed choice. In the same way that we know that driving a car is dangerous, but it doesn't stop us driving. Instead you learn the rules of road use, and so you can drive around more safely. And the same is true with Ecofluency. Learn the guidelines of having a nature communication experience or conversation well and safely, so that you can go forth and have your magical encounters and still be okay afterwards. Yeah, more enriched and nourished.
Right. And find support, study with a teacher in person or online. At the very least, get a book, consider gathering with a group of people who are also practicing, so that you can discuss questions and obstacles and amazing experiences and challenging experiences, because we are talking about a skill set. As you said, it's like driving, it's like writing, it's like reading, becoming very, very good in some physical activity. And so there are lots of reasons to have some type of mentoring, teaching, and support, whatever you decide is most suitable or accessible for you.
Yeah. Many people would say that nature communication looks shamanic. And you could say that it is. I wouldn't say that anybody who's a nature communicator is a shaman, for example. And it can be therapeutic, but it doesn't make them a therapist either. But in the same way that those who are practicing shamanic or therapeutic capacities, they've had to undergo training. And so that means both formal training, but also peer group work. And that's how in the first year after I did that workshop, that was how I developed my own confidence and trust and accuracy, was by practicing with a peer group and comparing notes. And I really recommend that. Thanks for raising that.
Yes, yes. So I'm curious, I guess, about 2 levels of this. For people who are listening to our conversation and have not yet embarked on nature communication, as far as they know, what do you suggest as good beginning practices? But also, I'm sure we're going to have listeners in your and my audience who already do this and would like to hear you say, how do I go deeper? So can you just share, what are you telling the people who work with you who are brand new and the people who are experienced and looking to advance?
The first invitation, the most important one I have, is please do it and do it well. Do it safely. By well, I mean look after yourself in the process, because the process of communicating with other than humans as equals invites us to examine our own relationship dynamics and patterns on many levels. And this can challenge many people's entire perception of reality, which can bring up very delicate and very deep personal revelations. And for these to be integrated in a nervous system friendly manner, it means that developing your ecofluency capacity and enacting the changes that might come about through that in your life might need to be done at a gentle pace. Really go at it in a way that just doesn't overwhelm you, because then it's not going to be really helpful. It might be that a conversation you have feels overwhelming. That could be the case with even a human often. So regulate yourself, take responsibility for your own process, seek support, like Shara's mentioned. But either way, doing this is an act of eco-socio-cultural repair. And like any skill, it takes time to develop. So being patient and gentle with yourself and trusting the process unfolding in the own way, in the way that you need, is maybe the most helpful. If you're setting the intention that you always get what you need, that you always get it in the right time, working with those intentions very clearly and being honest with yourself at every step of the way, no matter how difficult that is. I still find it really difficult. That is probably the biggest point that I would put down there.
Yeah. As you say that, I find myself thinking about both courage and joy. As you said, eco-cultural repair. Am I missing a word there?
Eco-socio-cultural repair.
Eco-socio-cultural repair. And when I heard you say that, I started thinking about how we need to encourage one another right now to be courageous, because so many types of eco-socio-cultural repair are going on right now, and they're very confronting. We are still in, I think, literally every nation and culture of the world, we are still trying to repair gender dynamics. And we are very actively and with pain and challenge and hope engaged in repairing dynamics across race and ethnicity. And at the same time, humanity, more and more of us are engaged at some level in repairing the human relationship with the natural world and with Earth. And that's a lot, it's very beautiful. And I think that's where the joy comes in, because there's so much potential for beauty, elation, support, all of this wondrousness as we engage in all these types of repair. But it's a lot that is going on planet Earth right now. So just as you were talking, I was thinking, yes, courage, joy in going forward in all these types of repair, which, as you very helpfully pointed out, can be challenging, can be confronting, can involve us asking a lot of questions about who we are and why we're here and what is the right way to interact with another person, plant, animal, ecosystem, body of water, etc.
Well, absolutely. And either those changes happen with us consciously, or they happen and we get swept along with it.
Yes.
And I'd rather be somebody who's like in that boat paddling along going, yeah, white water rafting. I'm doing this with the river. Rather than like feeling like you're being swept away and drowning in the process. Yes. And this is one of the ways in which we can make sure that those changes are done. I wouldn't say with our consent, because I believe that we have chosen to be alive now in order to go through this process, but to do so in a way that is conscious and it's deliberate. Yeah, and that's where the courage, the bravery comes in, to face the difficulties head on. Often they're far less scary than we realize, than we thought they were.
Yes. And there are, I would say we're seeing more over the last century as humans on Earth, that there are so many rewards when we step out of hierarchical relationships and back into collaborative relationships. And I think it's worth noting, the history of this over the last century, because I would guess that a majority of people alive on the planet right now would say there is a lot to be said for gender equality. It makes life better. And there is a lot to be said for equality across race and ethnicity. It makes life better. Similarly, there is a lot to be said for us being back in a multi-way communication with nature's beings. It makes life better. So you can easily make a case and paint a picture that on the other side of some bumps we're working through is a much more glorious experience of life on this planet. And I am continually trying to welcome people into that vision. I think you are too, because we have a lot to be excited about and look forward to. And I actually don't think that's receiving enough attention right now.
No, people are thinking like, oh God, what a time to be alive. We could change it to be like, what a time to be alive. Yeah,
it's so true. What else do you feel you would like to share or point out as we start moving toward a close of this lovely time together, Saskia?
Maybe bringing it back to the beginning, where we were talking about the shift from a more conventional Western science dominated worldview or centered worldview. I would say that still many people are focused on generating knowledge to add to the human knowledge base. And what we often forget is that knowledge is the product of knowing that's come through various filters. And so nature communication offers that way of deeper knowing that goes right back to the core. It's a way of communicating that exists beyond all languages. It's as old as time. And this is a way of really regenerating ourselves, the land, our hope, our way of life. Yeah. And I don't know if you wanted to still ask anything about skepticism and newcomers, welcoming them.
Yes, you're welcome to address that. I felt that some of the things you said earlier about your own process helped us walk through that, but I would love to hear more thoughts from you on that. It's something I encounter all the time. A lot of people in my circle are not open to this kind of work, and I know we're all encountering that in the world. So I'd love to hear your view on how do you talk with people who are skeptical, and maybe they have just a tiny bit of desire to engage, but then they're also really pulling back or even criticizing.
Like any situation, like any person, it will be dependent on where they are. So meeting them where they are becomes the challenge, but also becomes an art to navigate that field. And I welcome skepticism because I don't believe that it's a good idea to just believe anything that you hear. I certainly don't expect anybody to believe everything or anything that I say. I'd say that would be lazy. So having skepticism is healthy in order to help to stay grounded. That being said, I invite anybody who's new to this field to gain their own experiential evidence, because I know that that's what I needed in order to be convinced of this. And even then, I needed to experience it a number of times. But it's okay if you don't get anything at first. Maybe you go into this really open-minded and gentle-hearted, and you start slowly, but nothing happens. And you're like, okay, I give up. This is nonsense. That's okay. It's not just about you. It's still meaningful for the other than humans, because any attempts to dialogue with them in this mindful, heartfelt way is, like we said, this act of cultural repair. It's what Andrew Harvey calls sacred activism. So even if you don't feel consciously like you've gotten something, it's very, very likely, I would go so far as to say that I guarantee that on some level you have received something. And it could
contributed something.
And contributed something. Absolutely. And it might just be a while before something happens. I've met only one person in the last 10 years who was convinced that she was not able to communicate with nature. She had gone on one weekend workshop and had believed that because she didn't, after 3 or 4 times she tried and she didn't remember getting anything, that nothing happened. But yet, when I asked her more about her experiences in everyday life, both before and after that workshop, she realized that she'd actually been doing this all along. And it was just reframing how she perceived nature communication. We are nature, so we are already communicating with each other. Well done, you're a nature communicator already.
Yeah, right. And I think sometimes people don't realize that their awareness that a plant in their environment needs water, sure, that could be an intellectual assessment, but there's a part of you that might be observing that in an extrasensory intuitive way. So there are these very simple kinds of things we can overlook, right?
Totally. And so the invitation is just, rather than taking this on as something you believe, sit with the feeling of what would happen to your life if you were to take it on. If you were skeptical, that's cool, but what's the worst that could happen? And then what's the best that could happen? And how does that affect your decision? Yeah. And what we're capable of in nature communication is literally only limited by our own human imagination.
Yes. And, just like with the acquisition of any new skill, if someone is setting out on a new physical fitness program, we don't expect to go from bare beginner in running, skating, cycling, hiking, whatever you're going to do. We don't expect to go from bare beginner to advanced in a day or a week, often not even in a month or a season. So it's worthwhile to mention that, as you intimated, that this can take some practice. It is the cultivation of a skill.
Equally, you might get this beginner's luck experience of having this really deep experience, and then your progress plateaus for the next few months. And that's okay. That's happened to me. Just be patient. That's normal. Progress is never linear in nature, really. It would be weird if it were. That would be like fitting it to human perceptions of what is progress. So, the last thing I'd say is that, conversation's always open and the world is waiting for you.
I love that. Thank you, Saskia. For people who want to engage more with your work, give us a description of what you are doing and offering now. People can find you at ecofluency.org. And what are your current offerings?
So I focus on 3 things. I teach, I consult, and I promote the voices of other humans in this field, the work of other humans in this field. And in my teaching, I offer in-person and online courses and workshops. So this autumn, because I'm based in the UK, I've got 2 weekend retreat workshops coming up. I don't know if the podcast will come out in time for the first one, but there's, this is something I'm hoping to keep running also next year. and expand on. But there's also always the online courses, and those are open, very helpful to those who are international. And so I do 2 formats at the moment. One is a little 3-day introduction, and one is a 6-week more in-depth course. And those act as fantastic foundations to being able to learn how to communicate with nature safely and effectively and efficiently and meaningfully. And the other thing is that I consult. And so that I offer to individuals, groups, organizations, and I call them consultations with nature because that's essentially what they are. I act as a mediator, like a translator, because I receive information, I relay it, and the other way as well. And so many of the people who come onto my courses or workshops also have had or end up doing consultations. And I'm also hoping to expand it in other ways, but I'm wary of going too much into description. I think that currently summarizes what I do. One of the best ways of staying up to date with what I do offer is through the newsletter, so that you can sign up through the website. Because it's in the newsletters that I also introduce a new voice in the field in every newsletter. So I call that Other Voices in the Field. And so Shara will be featuring in one of those in the coming months. And also on the website. So there's a number of resources on the website that people can look at and learn more about videos and interviews with myself and with others, and fantastic books. And there's a long reference list there of books. It's not exhaustive, but it's a start. And if anybody has questions, they can always reach out to me. My email address is saskia@ecofluency.org if anyone wants to, who's listening to this, wants to contact me directly. And like Shara mentioned in the beginning, I want to make this work available to people. So one of my ways of giving back, because of my background in agriculture, is by offering farmers, beekeepers, and students of any field either discounted or free spaces in my courses and my workshops. And if anybody who's not one of those categories, would still like to attend and really cannot, then just email me and we can figure out a way of allowing you to still join, because that's my core aim, is getting more people to do this. And I don't want finances to be a barrier. I know what that's like.
Beautiful, Saskia. I have huge respect for the array of work you're doing. And like you, I share your interest in wanting to help people realize there are more and more and more of us doing this work. This is not a tiny fringe thing anymore. So I love that in addition to bringing forth your own work, you're drawing your audience's attention to other people in this space. What a joy for me to connect with you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope we'll get to talk again.
Thank you, Shara. Thank you so much for having me. And I really look forward to this work being aligned with more harmony and abundance and joy for all of life and our beloved Earth and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Humans and Earth. Please share this episode to broaden engagement in the regeneration our world needs. You'll find social media links in the show notes. To explore our other offerings, visit www.humansandearth.com.